So thank you so much for all of you being here and wanting to participate in this discussion. It's a very timely and important discussion that I think needs to be had, and I think people are more open at this point because of everything going on. It's sad that all of this has to go on for people to be on people's radar, but I'm excited about the conversation we had. Let's start with some ground rules. So please get yourself on mute if you're not speaking, just so you don't have any background noise or distractions, just for respect for the panelists. Still can't hear me?
Your audio is a little bit shaky. Maybe if you try to turn off your video stream for a second and try that.
I'll try that then. Okay.
We love seeing your face, but.
All right, is that a little better?
It's a lot better.
Okay, great. So I'll just do that for now. So the ground rules is keep yourself muted if you can, just to prevent background noise. If there are any questions during the talk, please put them in the chat so I can kind of filter through them and coordinate the questions. And lastly, any disruptive behavior or abusive behavior will be blocked from the forum by Brad. So please just be respectful of our participants and our panelists, please. First and foremost, I think it's appropriate that we have a short moment of silence for. Oh, so this forum is being recorded. Thank you, Leo. So please keep that in mind when you're speaking and you're addressing. Can you all still hear me?
Now is better, but it was a little choppy for a second.
Okay, sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Let me see.
I guess if it keeps breaking up, I could have you try calling into the meeting with your phone.
Yeah. Should I just do that now, or should I just try to continue?
Yeah, maybe try to do that, and then we could, in the meantime, just say a few words about who we are, and then you can kind of pick up there.
All right, let me just try it from my phone really quick, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Rahsaan, do you want to just say who you are and what you do, just real quick?
Sure. Greetings, everyone. My name is Rahsaan Hall. I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts and NUSL alum, class of '98.
And I'm Leo Beletsky. I'm a professor of law and health sciences at Northeastern, where my research focuses on drug policy and policing. And I'm really excited to have Rahsaan here and have Moriah be our fearless leader. And hopefully we can get the audio issues taken care of so she can get us started, get us rolling here.
Right, so this is Moriah. It's Moriah's iPhone now. Can you hear me okay on the iPhone?
Much better.
Okay, great. So we'll just move forward with that.
You can probably get your video on now too. Yeah, there you go.
There we go. Great. So I have both just in case so I can, handle it. So I think based on the gravity of this conversation, I think it's important to uplift the names of those who have been slain at the hands of police officers. And there are far too many to list during this forum, but I'm just going to lift up the names of a few of them, and then we'll follow that with a short moment of silence. Tatiana Jefferson, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Elijah McClain, Botham Jean, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice. And those are just a few of the people, the Black people that have been slain at the hands of police brutality. We'll sit here for about a minute of silence, please. Please mute yourself if you aren't already. All right, so we're gonna get started. Thank you for participating in the moment of silence. So all my notes are on my phone, so I'm gonna be on camera using this one and then using my notes on my phone. So in the wake of COVID-19, the nationwide mobilization of Black Lives Matter movement alongside the sudden awakening of society at large to racial inequities in this country, the opioid crisis, and the decriminalization of marijuana across the country, the war on drugs is at the cross-section of discussions about racial disparities in policing and access to healthcare. The war on drugs is yet another way in which our government and society has disproportionately criminalized Blackness and Black bodies. A war that almost exclusively targeted Black people and communities in a purported effort to stop or prevent the sale of drugs and the use of drugs. Most often, the use of crack cocaine and marijuana. The war on drugs is yet another justification to over-police Black neighborhoods and has been a means to overpopulate prisons with Black and brown bodies for nonviolent drug offenses. Until we have a candid conversation about systemic racism in all its forms and how it permeates the foundation of our legal system and all of our institutions, any semblance of progress and liberation will be futile. And that's why I'm really excited to facilitate this conversation and have this conversation today with our esteemed panelists who have already introduced themselves, Rahsaan Hall and Professor Leo Beletsky. So I'll have the panelists briefly introduce themselves really quickly for those who missed it, and then they can give some insight on how their work and their scholarship are implicated by this topic, as well as some initial and opening thoughts on the topic at hand. So we'll start with Rahsaan Hall.
Thank you so much, Moriah. So should I just introduce myself and give my reflections, or introduce myself and let Leo introduce himself and then come back and give my reflections?
You can give your reflections now. That's fine.
Okay, cool.
And Leo can respond a little bit.
Sure. So again, Rahsaan Hall, I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts, and a proud alum of NUSL, class of '98. Good to see so many familiar faces, and glad to know that the legacy of this great institution pushes forward, particularly as it relates to public interest law and the issues that intersect there. My work at the ACLU as the director of the Racial Justice Program is helping to advise our integrated advocacy efforts. So through our litigation, legislative advocacy, and community organizing, we work to identify racial justice issues that are within the scope and mission of the ACLU's work, but then also to leverage the ACLU's resources, advocacy resources, to address issues that are impacting communities of color. I've been there for a little over 4 years. Prior to that, I was at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, where I was the deputy director. And prior to that, I was a prosecutor for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office for 8 years. And I prosecuted any number of gun, drug, and homicide cases. And so this question around the war of drugs and how we got to where we are causes me to reflect on my own role in executing the war on drugs, those years that I served as a prosecutor. It's certainly not lost on me that this moment that we're in, where there are people who are decrying police violence, that it's nothing new. And some of the very things that I was a part of and complicit in are some of the very things that lead to what we've seen in these acts of police violence. And so, you know, that is just the tip of the iceberg. Seeing innocent people being killed by police is certainly disturbing. But what has provoked people to turn to the streets is not just that, but it is the history of racism and white supremacy and years of disenfranchisement in communities of color, particularly Black communities, that are exacerbated by kind of these most visceral moments when police kill somebody. The work that I did at the DA's office prosecuting drug cases at the time, my perspective was that I was doing something that was important. I was removing people from the community that were doing harm to the community, whether it was selling drugs to people who were compromised in some way or living in very vulnerable conditions, or the pertinent violence that went along with the illicit drug trade in communities. But what I was not fully aware of were the ways that that policing happens, particularly in communities of color, especially in Black communities and poor communities, are a function of this larger history of racism and its tool, the war on drugs. And thinking about this war on drugs beyond, you know, reining in drug use, arguably some of the motivations behind this war have been rooted in the historical fears of immigrants and people of color. When you think about the US's early attempts to regulate or restrict drug use in the early part of the 20th century, you know, the Pure Food and Drug Act of '06, or the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, or the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. You know, these are periods where there's racial and ethnic tension throughout the country. You think about the bloody summer of 1919. You think about the anti-immigrant perspective or sentiment directed towards Chinese immigrants. It was so pervasive throughout this country. Recognizing 1865 slavery ends, there is the Reconstruction period, there is a growth of Black engagement in electoral politics and business ownership. But in that post-Reconstruction period, when those federal troops are removed, what are the structures that are in place to maintain the social order that previously existed? It wasn't slavery anymore. That's why you see the rise of Black codes and lynchings, because there had to be a way to contain this population of the people who society had determined were less than, who had, the constructs of race and racism were built upon the ideology that in order to have this institution of slavery, there had to be a group of people who was less than. And once that institution was dismantled, there had to be some other form of social control to keep that population in check. And so in addition to the criminalization of Black people through Black codes, whether it was anti-miscegenation laws or trespassing laws or anti-vagrancy laws, you look at the way that narcotics begin to be used as another tool to address the concerns of the Black population. With in an effort to address maybe some of the disparities in trade between the US and China, this effort to tax and regulate opium and cocaine. The opponents to that were mainly Southern states under the auspices of states' rights. But then there's this article that surfaces that talks about Negro cocaine fiends, right? And it creates this image of a monstrous Black man under the influence of cocaine. And that legislation swiftly gets enacted because it plays off of the racist stereotypes and fears, and again, looking to regulate or control this population. And it's consistent throughout our country's history, finding ways to marginalize people of color, but particularly Black people. When Jim Crow was the law of the land, legal segregation was the law of the land, Jim wasn't alone. He had an uncle named Sam. And it was through the Social Security Administration Act that excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers, which were overwhelmingly Black people. It was through redlining that denied federal loans to Black people who were seeking to purchase homes. It was through the Federal Highway Administration that funneled funds into cities to build highways that would raise entire Black communities. And so when you think about the concentrations of poverty that existed in communities of color, the illicit drug market comes in and presents itself as a viable option for people. But even in that pre-1950s area, there's still levels of crime, there's still illicit drug sales, but we haven't seen what we weren't seeing then, what we're seeing now, which is this massive investment in prosecuting this war. And so from the Johnson administration's war on poverty, which didn't really address the underlying societal issues the way that they felt it should, to that pivot to the war on crime, where there's this building out of the carceral infrastructure with more money going to policing and tactical police units and more money going to the building out of juvenile justice centers and more laws coming on the books like the Rockefeller laws, where you're seeing the introduction of mandatory minimum sentences, and Nixon, through his Southern strategy as the law and order candidate, invokes this war on drugs. And by the time he does that in 70, 71, the carceral infrastructure is built out so significantly that it just creates this funnel that is that Black and brown people are poured into. And we see this exponential growth in the prison population. And what's unfortunate is that Nixon certainly had other information available to him about what are some of the concerns of young people in the country and what could be done to address the ills, but the focus on drugs created a unique opportunity to other certain groups, whether it's hippies or whether it's Black people, and evoke some of those fears and execute his Southern strategy. And part of the problem, separate and apart from the trillions of dollars or the $1 trillion that have been spent on prosecuting this war, are the huge racial disparities in who gets prosecuted. When you think about the 86 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, where the 100-to-1 crack disparity was introduced, 85% of the people who were prosecuted under those laws were Black, even though a majority of the users of crack cocaine are white. that says something about the motivations behind this law. The locations where policing happens speaks to the motivations behind this law. The ACLU in 2014, we did a report called Black, Brown, and Targeted that looked at where policing happens in the city of Boston. And it showed that of the 200 some odd thousand FIOs, or field interrogation stop and frisk reports, 63% of them were in Black communities, and Black people only made up 24% of the city of Boston's population. And this is after researchers controlled for the crime in the community, a person's prior criminal history. And so the level of policing that happens in communities of color is a significant concern. And this is in the face of the fact that Black and white use and sell drugs at relatively comparable rates. The amount of money that has been invested in militarizing police and making military equipment available, more funding for SWAT techniques or units to execute no-knock warrants, which is what Breonna Taylor, who was recently murdered, it was police executing a no-knock warrant on a potential, what they thought was a drug case. Overwhelmingly, ACLU, we've done some research and we found that an overwhelming majority of no-knock warrants are executed for drug cases. Rarely are the type of cache of weapons that would justify a no-knock warrant ever found. It's also problematic that it gets baked in to the legal system. You think about US v. Armstrong, where the defendant is trying to show that the racially disparate nature in which these sentences are prosecuted, or these cases are prosecuted, violates the Constitution. But the court couldn't come to appreciate that there were significant racial disparities or that there was racial animus behind it, because the defendant couldn't provide any evidence that white people weren't being prosecuted for it, despite just looking at the gross disparities in who was being prosecuted for these offenses. So, I think the work that we're doing now around policing is trying to overhaul policing practices, is trying to hold police accountable in a different way. The conversations that are happening in the legislature, both at the state level and nationally, are addressing the oversized footprint of policing. But part of the reason the police footprint is so large is because of how the war on drugs has been executed, the amount of funding that has been gone through burn grants to police departments to execute this war on drugs. That builds out their department size, that builds out the type of equipment that they get, not to mention civil asset forfeiture and the way that policing for profit happens. And so that's what we're trying to do, is dismantle the infrastructure and the footprint, and reduce the footprint of policing, because the motivations for it have always had a racist element to them, and that it has done more harm than good to our community. So I'll stop there and look to you, Leo.
Thanks, Rahsaan. You hit on some of the key points and teed up a lot of the things that I wanted to mention. So thank you so much for that very comprehensive view. And I do want to, just before I forget, mention that this is being recorded. So if anyone feels like you may object to that, you may want to log off, or just if you provide any spoken or written material, it'll be recorded. So just wanted to flag that. So just to pick up on some of what has been mentioned already, I think that the first thing that I wanted to note is that when we look at the many of the names that Moriah invoked in the beginning of our call today, a lot of those folks were killed in some ways in connection to drug law enforcement, or drugs were invoked in the aftermath of their killings. So if you look at Breonna Taylor, Rahsaan has already mentioned that. Mike Brown, that was something, that event had a drug law enforcement element to it. Eric Garner was killed in the context of drug law enforcement in a different realm. So that was tobacco law enforcement. So even though there's a long historical road that got us to where we are today, drug law and drug law enforcement continues to play a very real role in metastasizing the size of police departments and the role of policing in people's lives, but also, as Rahsaan has mentioned, the element of policing is just one arm of a larger carceral system. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't mention that obviously systems of detention and incarceration, systems of social control through quote unquote community corrections, as well as other areas that all of our colleagues that are here in the context of economic empowerment, family law, employment law, immigration law. There are so many different areas of law that the war on drugs has permeated, and we can't forget about those areas as we talk about, sort of the way forward, because criminal law is just, again, one area of law that has been highly affected. I think that as a public health person, for me, an important thing to always invoke in these discussions is, yes, we do see police brutality that is, obviously staring us in the face, both in the context of these continued killings by police of people of color, as well as the brutal police response to the protests that we have observed in the last couple of months. And that is something that obviously is a huge important problem of its own, but in a public health context, we often are encouraged to ask, what is this symptomatic of? What are these very obvious events that we're observing, these racial disparities, these murders? What are the root causes of the data that we're seeing? And I think that one of the ways in which we can bring in the conversation about the war on drugs is that there is a legal architecture that exists, both in the criminal law context and as well as elsewhere, that has created the conditions for these events to occur, as well as that explains the disparities in enforcement, the wealth gap, and many, the home ownership gap, and many of the other observed, the data that often gets cited in conversations about structural racism. The legal architecture for that is the war on drugs. In many ways, the war on drugs is also, or the way that we regulate drugs is almost like legal redlining, because there's an arbitrary line that gets drawn between drugs that are quote unquote legal. That's where the sort of conversation about legalization is an odd one, or is uncomfortable in some ways, because many drugs are already legal. Opioids that are the source of the largest drug crisis, public health crisis in our history. There's an entire space of prescription drugs including opioids, including amphetamines, including many other, pretty sort of, I don't know, this idea of hard drugs, soft drugs, I don't know, but these are very, substances that are useful, but carry a lot of risks. And the line that gets drawn between, let's say, OxyContin and heroin from a chemical perspective is arbitrary. These are very similar substances. And the reason why that line was drawn in the way that it was drawn was because of racism. And having that legal architecture still in place in many ways has, created the conditions that have set the forces that really result in what we're saying. So one of the additional sort of data-driven proxies for the war on drugs and the racism and the racial kind of subjugation that it has engendered is our spending priorities. So Rahsaan has already mentioned, the heavy investment in carceral systems, and one of the projects that my lab is working on is trying to systematically audit budgets. Right now, we're just focusing on municipal budgets, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a visual representation here, if I can. Let me see. So I'm going to share my screen for a second. Can folks see this bar graph? Okay, so if we look at city budget numbers across the United States, on average, cities spend over $500 million on policing and punishment. So these are so this kind of like the carceral complex, which includes detention settings, police departments, prosecutors' offices, and so forth. And this number is actually higher than all of the expenditures and in health and supportive systems. So health includes like public health, substance use treatment, and support systems include employment, housing, and other kind of supportive services combined. So health and support get fewer resources than carceral systems. And obviously, there are limitations to these data because oftentimes people will say, well, of course, policing is a province of cities versus like the public health department is typically paid for by the county. Employment is a state, province of state. So, but I think that there's, two responses to that sort of notion. One is there's not really any reason why cities should apportion their funding this way. It's not like we already have, health and supportive services already taken care of, so we need to focus on, policing and controlling and punishing people. We're definitely lacking in those areas, and having this really skewed priority picture is something that needs to be questioned. That's number one. And number two is that policing and punishment also get a lot of resources from state and federal sources. So it's not really correct to say that, that's something that isn't invoked in those other areas. And we have systematically tracked, so I just will show you the Boston picture.
I think Leo got booted. Hopefully he can get back in.
Looks like you rejoined. Leo, are you back?
Let me
Yeah, it looks like his audio is trying to connect.
Okay.
While we're waiting for Leo to reconnect, please feel free to put questions in the chat based on what you've already heard, so I can start fielding those if you like. But he should be coming back any second.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I don't know. The system, for some reason, logged me off. I think I was saying something that didn't agree with Zoom. But anyway, maybe I'll stop trying to get fancy with the technology and just talk. So the overall picture is across U.S. cities, and Boston is definitely looks like those other the national picture that I posed, whereby our municipal priorities are definitely skewed towards carceral responses, and it's something that we need to question. And I think that one of the ways in which we can link this to the war on drugs and racial subjugation is that in many ways the reason why those priorities look the way they are is because over time the idea of public safety and public health has been sort of co-opted in framing public health and public safety in these rhetorical terms around the war on drugs, drug abuse, quote unquote, and sort of the, runaway problem of crime related to the illicit drug trade. So in many ways, we have allowed the carceral apparatus to define what it means to be safe and what it means to be healthy. And a lot of times those definitions really don't map onto actual scientific sort of understanding or metrics of what it means to be safe and what it means to be healthy. We have, again, to invoke the issue that I work on a lot, the overdose crisis. We have we over time have made enormous investments in carceral responses, and yet in that context, we still have the worst drug-related crisis of probably our country's history. That crisis had gone pretty much unabated for 20 years. We had, talk about flattening the curve of the overdose crisis had continued to climb and accelerate for 20 years. And the legal prescriptions that were, the legal remedies that were being deployed to address that crisis, in many ways reflect like our inane response to the current public health crisis that we're in, where you see, a lot of sort of political considerations entering the sphere, and what is being sold as effective responses. Fortunately in Massachusetts, we're seeing a little bit of a better picture than nationally, but overall, I think that politics and rhetoric oftentimes drive our policy responses versus public health evidence. And that's something that has been on very stark display during the overdose crisis because, again, starting from around 2000, you started to see a major increase in drug-related overdoses, and that pretty much had climbed until 2018. So that's 2 decades when things were continuing to unravel, and yet what was, the kinds of public policy responses that we were seeing were focused on, basically control and punishment, even in settings like the public health sector, where initiatives like prescription drug monitoring programs were billed as a way to promote public health, but really were essentially law enforcement responses that were couched in public health terms. So I guess what I really want to just kind of wrap up by saying that I really hope that we can build on our role as lawyers and as law students in applying critical thinking and challenging these efforts to essentially use public health and public safety rhetoric as a smokescreen for building up systems of oppression, which is essentially what we've seen over time in the drug policy space.
Thank you so much, Leo, for your insight. Both you and Rahsaan had a lot of great insight. I learned a lot from both of you just in those few minutes, so I appreciate you. We have a question. So a lot of Northeastern law students and Northeastern students in general have been organizing and pushing for defunding NUPD and shrinking their role on campus. This person says that President Ayoun's response has been a toothless community oversight board with no power. What are faculty and staff and doing to push against carceral enforcement on our campus? So obviously, campus enforcement and law enforcement is a huge part of the dialogue for a lot of us, especially those that are students. So what are your thoughts on potentially defunding more university police forces, and what we can do to push back against those structures that perpetuate racism?
Rahsaan, you want to respond to that?
Sure. I guess I'll start by saying I'm an abolitionist, and so even though, well, let me qualify that. I am an abolitionist. The ACLU is not an abolitionist organization. We have recently taken a position in support of the movement for Black Lives to divest from police and invest in community. That is a point of tension, I think, with a lot of people in the abolition space, because when other kind of grass tops organizations or elected officials come in and say, well, let's reimagine police, or let's shift away from or shift resources from policing, that's not abolition. And, I think what folks are doing to organize around defunding police is important. And it goes to the point that Leo was making earlier about challenging this public safety narrative that exists. Public safety is having a quality education. Public safety is having your mental health needs addressed. Public safety is having shelter and food security. These are the things that if there were greater investments in these, the overwhelming majority of what it is police are called to respond to would not be issues to begin with. And I think that's the overwhelming reality. And so maybe from an advocacy standpoint, is to, do a public records request to, or well, since it's a private university, it's not a public record, but see if the NUPD will provide data and statistics on the types of things that they respond to. And, it's also, it's not going to contain personally identifying information. You might not be able to get as much detail about the incident, but the types of calls that they respond to, but also the types of actions that police initiate, right? The trespassing, the disorderly conduct, the open container. When you sift through all of those incidents, you'll find that overwhelming majority are not the things that are automatically triggered when people say public safety. And I think that's one of the things that folks in the abolition space push up against is, you know, the retort is always, well, what about the murderers and rapists? That's just a small fraction of what police deal with. And to truth be told, police don't prevent crimes. Like this whole notion of crime prevention, they show up after the crime has been committed. There are certainly things that they can do for around crime suppression, but there's a lot that can be done from a crime suppression standpoint that can be handled through other institutions when you're addressing people's underlying needs. And so more information that can be culled together. I mean, especially if we're talking about faculty and students who might be research assistants, there is a wealth of information out there about how underlying needs, if addressed, get better outcomes and don't cause people to rely on policing. And then lastly, I think even though from a political strategy, the perspective of political strategy, it's certainly easier to say, you know, let's meet people where they're at and do the thing that is that makes the most sense. And that's why folks are talking about reimagining police, because you can get police on board with that. And by saying abolition, that it just shuts people down altogether and they're not going to engage. I think we've come to a point where, or maybe this point has always been there, but there's just more focus on it, that it's saying the most progressive, the most radical thing that is so impactful, so blunt and disruptive that people can't ignore it. The fact that there's a conversation about defunding the police that's being considered, I think, is a function of the fact that there have been people out there saying abolition and have been unapologetic in saying it. And so even if we lose folks in that conversation, those weren't the folks that we were going to get to begin with. And so it really challenges the narrative of public safety and the role of policing. And the more vocal people are about that, even to the extent folks say, well, that just gives fuel to the opposition and conservatives are going to rally around that. I think, fine, they're going to rally around anything that's, you know, pro justice and liberation. That's just kind of my own personal take. But I think there's some information that people can put that show how alternatives work better.
And just to pick up on that, I think bringing it back to the war on drugs, it would be interesting to understand how much of our university's enforcement focuses on drug law enforcement. My guess is that most of what NUPD's enforcement calls or enforcement practices focus on alcohol and drugs. And I think that invokes the legal, you know, again, legal architecture. What are our campus rules? We have a no tobacco policy, a very strict no tobacco policy. You know, illicit drug use obviously is prohibited. So the role of police is catalyzed by the legal framework. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I wanted, you know, there's some obvious kind of low-hanging fruit about the role of NUPD. For example, there was a discussion some time ago recently about the availability of assault rifles to NUPD officers, which, you know, why does a university police department that's situated in smack in the middle of a city that's already highly policed need, you know, these weapons? I think the answer is a little bit more, I mean, you know, at first glance, it seems like probably, you know, from a kind of operational standpoint, it seems a little bit absurd. On the other hand, I think that the other conversation that is happening on the side of law enforcement is that there's lots and lots of guns, including campus shootings. And so, again, you know, what is that a symptom of, and how can we fix that underlying root cause in order to allow a different conversation about police. And this is something that we need to engage in. I think that you know, in general, it does make sense to start at home and think about, you know, in our own institution, how do we you know, have a conversation about reimagining or whatever you might want to call law enforcement, defining safety, and thinking about deploying alternative crisis response systems, first of all, and then second of all, preventing crises from happening in the first place. And I think that's a really important conversation. That's kind of a microcosm for our city and our country, and you know, probably the world. So you know, from a public health perspective, we really want to focus on prevention. So how do we stop crises from getting to a point where a crisis response, be it police or somebody else, is necessary? And that's where we get back to the question of investment priorities, because investing in carceral systems certainly does not prevent crises. In fact, it precipitates crises. Investing in systems of support where you work upstream and have, you know, essentially safety nets so that people don't fall through the cracks, quote unquote, that's going to reduce the need for crisis response, be it police or others. I think there's some questions.
Yes, so we have one question. Well, we have a few, but here's the first one. Can either of you touch on the erasure of Black and brown women from discussions around criminal and carceral reform and abolition? Women are the fastest growing population in prisons and jails today, and like men, those women are disproportionately Black and brown. Patterns of policing that force Black and brown women into criminal and carceral systems include patterns of policing stemming from the war on drugs. Could either of you touch on the causes and implications of the erasure of Black and brown women from this conversation?
The patriarchy, toxic masculinity. It's always a struggle to be in spaces where people are talking about the need to address police violence because it's killing Black men, and which is true, but it's also killing Black and brown women and indigenous people as well. And that is kind of the historical struggle within communities of color, is the experience of women who have been the backbones of movements, although they may not have been the leaders, the perceived leaders. It's just like without women, these movements would have gone nowhere. But there's always a desire, because of the way society is structured in a patriarchal way, and that it prioritizes the needs of men and dances around male fragility, that women don't get the respect or have not gotten the respect that they deserve, or the attention to this. You know, the concern around the push out of Black children in schools really had a huge oversight in that it didn't talk about the exponential increase in the expulsion of Black girls relative to their representation in the population of students and compared to similarly situated white girls. And so that, I think that's always going to continue to be a problem. I think when we talk about abolition should be talked about through a feminist lens, because like if you're a feminist abolitionist, then it's inclusive, right? Because you're capturing many of the intersections that people who are oppressed through the carceral infrastructure are experiencing. So that's my perspective on it, and that's why I'm glad, like you know, Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives was started by Black queer women. Like that's that's who we need to be listening to and following. And when their voices are centered and prioritized and lifted up, then we're all lifted up.
Yeah, I've been absolutely inspired by the lifting up of the voices of women of color, including queer women of color in this current moment. I think that this, in many ways, has made it apparent that, as Rahsaan has said, that women of color have always been the backbone of the reform and abolitionist conversations. And I think it's an overdue recognition and realization that these voices are important to listen to and to take the leadership from. And in the drug policy space, the work of Michelle Alexander has been absolutely transformative. I think The New Jim Crow is a book that really has set the stage, at least in the kind of academic, intellectual circles, for the conversation about the role of drug policy as the, again, legal framework, legal architecture for systemic racism in our society. And there's been so many, Direcka Purnell and others who are just leading the charge right now, and it's inspiring, and frankly, it's been an opportunity for a lot of academics like myself to take a back seat and take leadership from them, and that's been I think it's been actually incredibly, aside from the fairness and kind of visibility questions, it's actually been in many ways transformative and effective, because a lot of the reforms that were led by the establishment previous to this, including during the previous administration, for 8 years, we knew this police violence, racialized police violence, had already percolated to the top and had already triggered a bunch of protests. And the way that it was being addressed really was more about theatrics than effective change. And so I think we're overdue for a different conversation. So.
Thank you. I think that provides a lot of great insight on the role of Black women and the especially Black queer women, as well as what we can do to protect Black women who are not often a big part of the conversation. Okay, so I want to try to fold some of these questions together because we do have a lot. So this is kind of like a twofold question. What can we do to turn the war on drugs and racism into a public health crisis or a public health issue instead of a criminal matter? For even further, what about drug courts, and how do we engage judges and in the legal system out of misunderstandings and biases that they have around the war on drugs, drug use, and addiction? So that's kind of like a pretty big question, but it kind of folds in some of the concerns that some people have brought up about what we can do to create a healthier environment around drug use.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think that one way in which we start to reframe this conversation, reframe the narrative. Actually, my lab has a project called Changing the Narrative, and it focuses on drug policy and addiction. So changing the narrative.news. I think that there's so many tropes, policy-wise, and then sort of in the media, where the way that we taught, the language that we use to talk about substance use and addiction, who we ask, the voices, this goes to the previous discussion. A lot of times when media they're covering drug policy issues, they talk to prosecutors and police. they are considered experts in these areas, and not people who are directly affected, not public defenders or defense counsel, and not public health folks. So I think that, you know, we're trying to change some of the actual narratives as well as the voices that get featured in the kind of public's eye about policy debates on drug issues and addiction. I think that we also, you know, in this context of talking about redefining public safety, I think that we need to have different metrics. The metrics that we use to define safety are fundamentally broken. It's like a circular, you know, tautological system where we define public safety around police operations. How many arrests? How many calls for service? How many pounds of drugs seized? These are not metrics of public safety. Even the crime statistics are highly, highly biased based on police, you know, criminal justice operations. And so, you know, this idea of like, you know, evidence-based policing around CompStat and the hotspot policing, you know, it's in many ways, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby if you have a certain number of arrests, that's where you throw, you know, that's considered high crime area, and then you throw a bunch of police in that underserved area, and then you end up with even more arrests. So it's, you know, it's a cyclical situation. So thinking about metrics of public safety and public health and holding people accountable to actually effectively designing interventions, whether they're policy interventions or operational interventions, I think that's a really critical conversation that's a little bit in the weeds, but it's really highly important. And not allowing the carceral system to define success around its own operations is part of that. And the other, yeah, I mean, I think that carceral systems need to be broadly defined as well. We can't have this myopic focus on policing. Drug courts are an example of how, again, narratives about, you know, these health-based approaches, like saying, well, we can't arrest our way out of this, let's deploy drug courts, because it's a treatment mentality, it's a treatment framework. But at the outset, the question is, you know, why are we expanding the footprint, back to Rahsaan's point, why are we expanding the footprint of the criminal justice system to focus on treatment or to focus on social support? You know, like the Boston Police Department now employs a bunch of clinical social workers and homelessness outreach teams. Why do those need to be under a carceral roof? Why can't we spin out these systems by investing in departments that are other than police to do that work? And the question is because police, you know, in many ways guide the conversation. They have resources and they can ask. Oftentimes they use the fact that they have expanded their footprint to ask for more resources. This has been a really interesting, in my career, I've done a lot of research on with police officers, trying to understand what drives their law enforcement practices around drugs. And it's interesting because police officers, especially those on the ground, will readily admit and harp on the idea that their enforcement oftentimes is related to structural issues that they really have no business getting involved in, whether it's family drama, substance use, homelessness. Their own self-assessment is like, I don't want to be doing this work. Society is failing people, and that's continues to fall in my lap. And why am I didn't get into this job to do social work. And they're really stressed, burnt out, and extremely, there's extremely high levels of emotional problems, substance use among street-level police officers, partly because of these structural failures, and which I do think that drives excessive force as well. If people are highly stressed and really unhappy and have PTSD, that's going to drive incidents where police are acting out in ways that we see are evident. However, even though they realize that these structural factors drive a lot of the footprint expansion, the response, the prescription, so the diagnosis is correct. The prescription is somehow always, oh, well, we need more officers. We need more overtime. We need more, people need to be spending more time in jails and prisons. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you've seen this, huge expansion, metastasizing of the carceral state is because people who hold the power, who hold the conversation, who hold the narratives around how can we fix problems in our society, instead of saying, well, why don't we invest elsewhere? Why don't we invest in homeless services or housing or substance use treatment? Somehow it always comes back to let's create these systems within carceral institutions. And drug courts are one proxy of that, one expression of that, where you have a carceral system that's getting into treatment and then the results are pretty abysmal because it's not really designed to do that. And judges, making treatment calls about what people need, turns out it's not an effective approach.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have we have a few more questions. The next one is oriented in what's going on today as far as COVID-19. So can you provide some insight about the over-policing of Black people during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly with respect to violations of stay-at-home and mandatory mask orders?
Yeah, I don't have any recent data. I know that when the orders were coming out, at least at the ACLU, we were in communication with the mayor of Boston, strongly encouraging him not to enforce those mask or stay-at-home orders because it would only exacerbate the spread of this pandemic by taking someone into custody, holding them in a holding cell where there may be other people, and then carting them to court or holding them in that cell for a remote court hearing. So, I think the more appropriate approach, and we advocated for the more appropriate approach to take was more public education about this. But I haven't seen any data on arrests as it relates to these types of orders.
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, this is something that we're actually working on within the Health and Justice Action Lab. We are tracking the race, trying to figure out the race of people who have been cited or arrested for violation of public health provisions, and Rahsaan's absolutely right that Boston has kind of taken a little bit of a softer approach, but other cities haven't. And so what you end up with is, the pretty predictable mapping of enforcement onto existing patterns of over-policing in certain communities. So like there was a famous meme, pretty widely distributed meme where you had police distributing masks in New York City to people who were in, I think it was Battery Park or another, maybe Central Park, to white residents, while there was an incident where a police officer was like literally sitting on somebody's neck as a result of enforcement of social distancing. And so you have, again, like with drug law enforcement, disparate enforcement practices for the same violations. I think this also is a good opportunity to say that oftentimes there's an assumption, rhetorical assumption, where we talk about sort of law enforcement or criminal justice approaches versus public health approaches. whereby we assume that public health is more humane and more enlightened, and somehow we need to shift towards a public health approach. I think that has rhetorical power and in some ways, you know, plays into the hands of people like me who are public health minded folks. But it also brings up an important caveat, which is that public health itself is pretty carceral. It has a very sinister history, which Professor Wendy Parmet at NUSL has so eloquently written about. There's, you know, a long history of both racism and sort of punishment and control mentality within public health. And so when we talk about dismantling carceral systems, we have to pay attention to, you know, and then think about dismantling those systems within the criminal legal system, obviously, which is kind of the most obvious offender, but also within systems of quote unquote care. And this includes, you know, child welfare, family services. You know, I already talked about sort of housing and employment, but also within public health itself, which is often relied on its, literally the legal term of art for public health enforcement is the police power, right? So there's a very tight nexus between public health and policing. And in many ways, you know, the oldest kind of public health enforcement really relied on actual police to do the work, and it still does, despite the fact that the evidence that's supposed to drive public health action actually is pretty unequivocally against punitive responses and towards education, as Rahsaan has mentioned, but also creating the structural conditions where people can actually do the right thing. So it's not enough to tell people to do the right thing, like social distancing and wearing masks, but actually make it possible for them to do the right thing. So that should be the focus of a public health response, not beating people over the head or shaming them into actually following the rules.
So the next question we have is about recreational use and legalization of marijuana. So as states begin to decriminalize and legalize recreational marijuana use, what specific obligations do you think there should be on them to address the harms created by the war on drugs? While some places, including Massachusetts, have put forward paths to expunge, there's data that these tools are not fully understood or utilized due to their systemic barriers. Similarly, the tax money intended to go back into communities of color is going back to the state and being spent on things like policing. Beyond automatic expungement or sealing, are there more restorative justice or alternative approaches that would support the effort to address some of the harm created by the war on drugs?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things beyond the recommendations of automatic expungement. But the creation of economic empowerment loans and grants to employ people who have prior convictions, but not just the people who have been convicted. I think it is important for those people to specifically be included. But when you think about the execution of the war on drugs and the impact that it has had on entire communities, there was a question earlier about the erasure of Black women. One of the other pieces is the way that Black women have had to maintain households in the absence, or raise children in the absence of men who have been prosecuted and sent to jails for lengthy sentences. And the impact that that has on, there's studies that show that children who have incarcerated parents are more likely to be incarcerated themselves. The amount of funding that has gone to carceral services, like Leo was talking about, it has had a significant impact on the health and vitality of those communities. And so there's a need to be intentional about directing funding. And, and I recognize the potential constitutional concerns with saying this money is going to Black folks. But I think there are creative ways to direct funding to communities that is a little more specific than an economic empowerment license. Because, you could be white moving into Roxbury and you're from a historically marginalized community or a community that was impacted by the war on drugs, and that's not addressing the harm of the war on drugs. I think there's still a lot of work to do around decriminalization as well. Nationally, ACLU put out a report that looked at racial disparities in marijuana arrests, and there are significant racial disparities. In Massachusetts, Black people are 3 times more likely to be charged with a possessory marijuana offense. Now, what that means is because simple possession is fine up to several ounces. But what most likely is being recorded is the number of people who are charged with possession with intent to distribute, meaning the way that the marijuana was packaged or the other indicia of intent to sell that were present indicated that the person was going to sell, whether it was a statement that they made or a belief that a police officer has. And it's completely discretionary, up to the officer to make that charging decision. And so that's still a problem, and it is still criminalizing something that people who don't look like the folks who are getting prosecuted from, are benefiting. I'll never forget when I was a prosecutor, there was a case that I prosecuted. It was a young man, 18 years old. He was charged with possession with intent to distribute marijuana within 500 feet of a park. And he had no prior record. He was in court with his mother. And what I was authorized to do, and because it was next to a school zone, he was facing a 2-year mandatory minimum sentence. What I was authorized to do was break it down, so get rid of the school zone, but only if he agreed to taking a 2-year sentence suspended for 2 years. So he would have been on probation for 2 years with a 2-year jail sentence hanging over his head. So if he had a probation officer that wanted to violate him or he picked up a new offense, he's going to go away for 2 years. 18-year-old Black kid, no prior criminal record, in court with his mom. And the mama said, I'll take it, because for her, it meant her son wasn't going to jail that day. And I have no idea what happened to that young man. I don't know if he successfully completed his probation. I have no idea if he was violated or if he was at the wrong place at the wrong time and got charged with an offense and they sent him away for 2 years. And now we're in Massachusetts where there's this burgeoning marijuana industry, and the people who benefit from it most look nothing like that young man that I prosecuted. And so that's some of the harm that needs to be addressed through, whether it's through legislative enactments of or creations of a racial justice fund or something to that effect. But that harm needs to be dismantled.
And yeah, amen to that. And I would say, broad strokes, cannabis reform to me is a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary tale for those of us who are advocates who've been talking about dismantling the war on drugs, where unfortunately the reform is oftentimes rationalized in social justice and racial justice terms. But when you look at the actual legal, technical interventions that reform results in, they don't really address racial or social justice. Massachusetts we actually just came off a call, a Zoom session with our drug law and policy course at New Seoul, where Shalene Title from the Cannabis Control Commission was our guest. And the work in many ways single-handedly transformed the Cannabis Control Commission to focus on equity and focus on racial and social justice. Whereas, like, literally, if this person was not at the table, Massachusetts reform would look very different and would, in many ways, resemble reform in other states where even the basics like expungement is a total afterthought. The focus has really been on commercial interests and commercialization, and not on repairing the harms that have been done, and not thinking about creatively about, okay, how we're essentially reimagining a whole industry from scratch. How do we imagine that industry to actually address health and safety concerns and to be a source of benefit rather than being a source of benefit just for some and harm for others? So I think that as we talk about drug law reform, reforming the Controlled Substances Act, which is, this year marks its 50th anniversary, which is just a total antiquated, it's an artifact of racism and in a culture wars. It's not an instrument of, public health regulation. It really is an absurd statutory framework for regulating, potentially addictive substances. And some of them are not actually addictive, like psilocybin. So as we proceed down this path, I think cannabis reform is a cautionary tale because it has not gone, it has not reached the rhetoric that it was sort of rationalized by, and I think it provides, somewhat of a roadmap of how we need to have those conversations, and in many ways the role of lawyers in actually designing the kinds of legal interventions and reforms that can do the things that these reforms are purported to do.
Thank you for all that insight. It seems like we only have time for one last question. So to tie up this discussion, since drug regulation is often a federal issue, what can local legal advocates, organizers, activists, public policymakers do to stop the harm created by the war on drugs and to begin to repair the harm? So I know that's like a big question, but maybe just a couple bullet points on like things that people can do on a community level and an individual level as well.
It is a local level, right? There are still a lot of criminal laws on the books locally, at the state level. An overwhelming majority of the people who are incarcerated for drug offenses are incarcerated at the state level. And I think advocacy around decriminalization, advocacy about public health alternatives, non-carceral public health alternatives to dealing with substance use disorder is important. I think the language we use is also important, how we reframe these issues and instead of calling people addicts, talk about people who have substance use disorder, stop talking about substance abuse. I think that language matters. And then being supportive of the people who are on the ground doing the advocacy and who are advocating on behalf of populations that are struggling with substance issues, like the Boston Users Union or SIFMA now, Supervised Injection Facilities in Massachusetts now, engaging in those conversations, educating oneself to be knowledgeable about the issue, and being intentional about talking about race and how race is a factor, a driving factor in the execution of this war on drugs. And if it is not central in the dismantling of this war, we'll run the risk of the unintended consequences of white folks getting the benefit of the reforms that get enacted, but then huge racial disparities because Black and brown folks aren't considered.
Yeah, I think I would just very quickly say that I do think that a lot of the action is on the local level. You know, we talked in the beginning of the call about the huge disproportionate investment on the local level in carceral systems. There's no reason why that should be the case. We need to, and it's happening. There's a lot of discussions at the City Hall right now in Boston and Cambridge about reinvestment, and drug law enforcement happens primarily through municipal policing, not through state or federal law enforcement. So that's where the action is. And I think that a lot of the reform, drug law reform, has always been percolated from the local level. So, you know, Denver and some other cities have started down a path of complete decriminalization. I think Boston can follow, you know, Boston and surrounding communities can follow suit. Also, Rahsaan, do you want to talk about the police bill that you just filed on Beacon Hill?
Yeah, there's a lot that that was included in the Senate package. Very robust bill that seeks to rein in police. It creates a police decertification regime where officers can have to be certified but then decertified. It allows for juvenile expungement. It broadens the number of offenses that can be considered for expunging a juvenile's record. It reins in police use of force. It puts limits on chokeholds and tear gas and rubber bullets and limits on no-knock warrants. There's the way the bill is written now, it doesn't go far enough. But there's a lot of advocacy that we're doing. There were 145 amendments filed on yesterday on a bill that was introduced Monday. So a lot of advocacy is happening. We're still kind of in the trenches trying to make sure that the reforms that we're pushing for are being met. It takes an attempt at limiting qualified immunity at the state level. There are also efforts to create a justice reinvestment fund. So any savings that would be accrued through reducing the carceral footprint would be invested in this fund and spent on non-carcerative and non-police community alternatives. So there's quite a significant number of reforms that are included there. There's a ban on face surveillance technology or moratorium on face surveillance technology. The House has not put their bill out, but they're working on a bill. It's not clear entirely what will be included. But there's a significant opportunity to see some meaningful police reform, but it's going to require advocacy organizations and individuals to call their elected officials and push for as many of the progressive reforms as possible.
Yeah, I just dropped the link to that bill, the Senate version, into the chat. So for anyone who was interested, it's an opportunity to get involved. So I think we're out of time, though.
Yes, we are. But I just want to thank our esteemed panelists for all the insight, information, and history, and everything that you provided in this this discussion. So thank you so much for your time and for your work all the work that you're doing to continue to fight for injustice in our systems. Thank you all that participated in the conversation. Thank you for all the questions. I wasn't able to get to all of them, but thank you so much for submitting them. So I hope that we can continue to have this conversation and move forward so we can have a system where there's less harm on Black and brown bodies. So thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you, Moriah, for being our esteemed leader
Yeah,
today.